The rich woman humiliated the waitress, but froze when she found out who owned the restaurant. Subscribe and tell us where you're watching us from. The evening air outside La Lumiere was crisp, carrying the faint scent of the ocean breeze from the harbor just a few blocks away. Inside, the restaurant buzzed with quiet elegance, a place where the wealthy and powerful dined beneath the glow of ornate chandeliers, their conversations a hushed symphony of privilege and exclusivity. The walls, adorned with classical artwork, absorbed the ambient warmth of the golden lights, while waiters moved gracefully between tables, balancing silver trays with the precision of seasoned performers. Among them was Leah. She wove between tables, her posture straight, her movements efficient despite the fatigue weighing on her limbs. She had been on her feet for hours, her double shift stretching into the late evening, but she refused to let the exhaustion show. It was a matter of dignity, of pride. Every step she took, every plate she carried, was a step closer to the future she envisioned for herself. College was expensive, but she was willing to endure long hours and condescending glances if it meant she could one day sit in a classroom instead of serving those who had never known the burden of struggle. Tonight was no different. The guests at La Lumiere, draped in designer clothing and polished jewelry, barely acknowledged the presence of those who catered to their every whim. It was something Leah had long grown used to, the way her existence faded into the background the moment she donned the crisp white apron of her uniform. She didn't mind. At least, that was what she told herself. Across the dining hall, a trio of women entered, their presence commanding attention the moment they stepped inside. At the forefront was Victoria Cross. Tall, blonde, and poised with the practiced ease of someone born into wealth, she exuded an effortless arrogance. Her red dress clung to her slender frame, the diamonds around her neck catching the light as she glanced around the room, assessing the space as if she owned it. Behind her, Julia and Madison followed, their laughter light and lilting, a melody that hinted at superiority and amusement at the world around them. They were women who had never been denied anything, who had never needed to lift a finger for what they had. Their lives were a series of exquisite experiences curated for their enjoyment, untouched by hardship or struggle. Leah recognized them immediately. Victoria was a regular at La Lumiere, a patron whose presence sent subtle ripples of tension through the staff. She was demanding, impatient, and cruel in the way only those with unchecked privilege could be. Leah had served her before, had stood quietly as Victoria dismissed her with a flick of the wrist, her instructions laced with the kind of sharpness designed to remind those beneath her of their place. As they were led to their table, one of the best in the restaurant, positioned near the floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the city, Victoria strode forward with the confidence of someone accustomed to deference. She didn't need to ask for special treatment. It was already assumed. Leah exhaled softly, adjusting the tray in her hands as she prepared herself. She had handled worse. She could handle this. She approached the table, offering the practiced smile she had perfected over the years. "Good evening. Welcome to La Lumiere. May I take your drink order?" Victoria didn't look at her. She continued speaking to Julia, her voice carrying the effortless dismissal of someone who considered interruptions an affront. Leah stood there, patient, waiting. The seconds stretched, the hum of conversation around them filling the space where acknowledgement should have been. Finally, without turning her head, Victoria spoke, her voice light but edged with something colder. "I'll have a glass of Chateau Margaux, the 2015 if you have it, otherwise something drinkable." Her words were punctuated with a soft laugh from Madison, who sipped at the water that had been placed before her. Leah nodded, ignoring the sting of irritation that threatened to creep in. She had dealt with people like Victoria before. She knew the game. Julia and Madison placed their orders with the same air of detachment, their eyes never quite meeting Leah's as they spoke. She wrote everything down, her grip on the notepad firm, then turned to walk away. Behind her, Victoria's voice carried just loud enough to be overheard. "They'll hire anyone these days, won't they?" Laughter followed, light and elegant, as if the cruelty were nothing more than a private joke between friends. Leah's fingers tightened around the tray she carried. She didn't stop, didn't turn. She had long learned that dignity was best preserved in silence. She continued walking, back straight, shoulders squared, willing herself to ignore the growing discomfort settling in her chest. It was just another night, just another table, just another reminder of the distance between people like her and people like them. And yet, across the room, a pair of sharp eyes followed the exchange with quiet interest. Seated at a discreet table in the corner, Henry Beckett observed, his expression unreadable. He had seen it all, the subtle glances, the way Victoria had ignored Leah as if she were nothing, the way Leah had straightened her posture even as the words brushed against her like a blade. He said nothing. Not yet. Instead, he lifted his glass, taking a slow sip as he continued to watch, waiting. The evening progressed with the slow rhythm typical of La Lumiere's finest nights, muted conversation, the occasional clink of glasses, the quiet glide of waiters moving between tables with practiced ease. The low hum of classical music wove through the air, mingling with the warm glow of candlelight that flickered atop every linen-draped table. It was the kind of atmosphere meant to foster indulgence, a sanctuary for the privileged to bask in their own refinement. Leah moved through it with measured steps, her tray balanced effortlessly in her hands, her face an unreadable mask of composure. It was a skill she had learned early, a necessary shield against the kind of people who mistook kindness for servitude and silence for weakness. She had endured long enough to know that the best way to survive in a place like this was to let their words roll off her like rain against glass. But Victoria Cross had a way of pressing just hard enough to leave cracks. When Leah returned to their table with their drinks, Victoria still did not acknowledge her presence. She continued speaking to Julia, her manicured fingers tapping idly against the rim of her glass as she recounted some anecdote that sent her companions into fits of delicate laughter. Leah waited. She did not clear her throat or shift her weight to indicate impatience. Such things were unnecessary. This was part of the game, after all. Victoria would speak when she chose, and Leah would stand there, invisible until summoned. Finally, Victoria glanced at her, a slow and deliberate shift of her gaze, as if just noticing she had been standing there all along. "Oh, you're still here," she murmured, her lips curving into something that was not quite a smile. Julia let out a breath of amusement, and Madison flicked a glance toward Leah, taking in her uniform as though evaluating an object of questionable quality. Victoria reached for her wineglass, lifting it with a delicate precision that seemed almost theatrical. She studied the deep red liquid for a moment before taking a sip. A pause. Then a soft, unimpressed exhale. "Did I not ask for the Chateau Margaux?" Leah blinked once, careful to keep her expression neutral. "Yes, ma'am. This is the 2015 Chateau Margaux." Victoria swirled the wine in her glass, watching the way it clung to the sides. "Are you sure?" she asked, her tone light, but with an undercurrent of something sharper, something meant to be heard beyond the surface of the words. "Because it doesn't taste quite right. Perhaps you should double-check before assuming." Leah kept her voice steady. "I can certainly confirm with the sommelier if you'd like, ma'am." Victoria's lips curved. That would be wise. She set the glass down with deliberate care, as if to punctuate the moment with just enough weight to make it linger. The other women at the table exchanged amused glances, sipping at their own drinks with the satisfaction of those who knew the rules of this particular game all too well. Leah nodded once, collected the untouched glass, and turned to leave, feeling the weight of their laughter trailing after her like a shadow. By the time she reached the bar, her grip on the tray had tightened just enough to make her knuckles ache. She inhaled slowly, releasing the breath in a controlled exhale before setting the glass down before the sommelier. Sebastian, the restaurant's head sommelier, lifted a brow at her. "What's wrong?" "Nothing," Leah said smoothly. She wants confirmation that this is in fact the 2015 Chateau Margaux. Sebastian let out a slow breath through his nose, understanding immediately. "Of course she does." Leah said nothing as he poured a new glass, the exact same wine from the exact same bottle, and handed it back to her. She took it without a word and returned to the table. Victoria watched her approach, waiting. Leah placed the fresh glass down carefully, stepping back with the same professional poise she had carried throughout the evening. "Here you are, ma'am. The sommelier has confirmed this is indeed the Chateau Margaux 2015. Victoria studied her for a moment, then picked up the glass, taking a slow sip. Another pause. Then she set it down with a small, satisfied nod. "I suppose it will do." Julia smirked, and Madison let out a soft, knowing laugh. "Next time," Victoria added, her voice pleasant, almost kind, "try to get it right the first time." It was not a suggestion. Leah's pulse beat against her ribs, but she did not let her face betray even the smallest flicker of emotion. "Of course, ma'am," she said evenly before turning and walking away. This time, she did not hear laughter behind her, but she knew it was there. The evening stretched on, and the game continued. And each time Leah approached the table, there was another comment, another test, a glance that lingered just long enough to be unsettling, a whispered remark that just barely escaped the threshold of audibility but was intended to be heard, a request that was just a fraction too particular, just specific enough to inconvenience. And through it all, Leah endured, because that was what she had always done. Because that was what she had to do. The final test came when she was clearing their plates. Victoria leaned back in her chair, watching as Leah reached for the last dish. Then, with an almost careless flick of her wrist, she nudged her elbow against the glass of water beside her. The movement was subtle, easy to mistake for an accident, if not for the way Victoria's lips curved just slightly as the glass tipped. The water spilled, soaking the crisp white tablecloth, cascading in a slow, deliberate arc, straight toward Leah's hand. She barely managed to pull back in time, but not before the cold liquid splashed across her fingers, dampening the edge of her uniform. "Oh," Victoria said in a tone of mock concern, "how clumsy of me." Julia and Madison stifled laughter behind delicate hands, their eyes bright with amusement. Leah's fingers curled around the damp cloth of her apron, her pulse a steady, measured beat in her ears. Slowly, she looked up. For the first time that evening, she met Victoria's gaze directly. Victoria's smile did not falter, but there was something there, something sharper beneath the polished exterior, a glimmer of satisfaction, of amusement at the game she had been playing all evening. Leah inhaled, steady. Then, with the same quiet dignity she had carried all night, she straightened, stepping back. "I'll bring a fresh cloth for the table," she said, her voice smooth and unwavering. She did not wait for a response. She turned and walked away, each step precise, deliberate, controlled. She did not let them see the way her fingers trembled. Across the restaurant, Henry Beckett watched, and this time he did not just observe. This time he moved. The night had settled into its usual rhythm at La Lumiere, crystal glasses clinking in quiet toasts, the soft hum of conversation filling the space between candlelit tables, the scent of seared duck and truffle lingering in the air. But beneath the practiced elegance of the evening, an undercurrent of tension wove itself into the atmosphere. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, yet undeniable. Leah felt it with every step she took. Her hands had long since dried from the water Victoria had so conveniently spilled, but the damp chill still clung to her skin, a phantom sensation that refused to fade. It wasn't the coldness of the liquid that lingered, it was the intent behind it. The way Victoria had looked at her, the smirk that had played at the edges of her mouth, the quiet pleasure she had taken in seeing Leah stand there, drenched and humiliated, knowing that nothing would be done about it. Because nothing ever was. Leah had spent years learning the rules of this world, the invisible lines drawn between those who mattered and those who did not. She knew exactly where she stood in Victoria's eyes, an afterthought, a piece of the scenery, something to be used and discarded at will. She had accepted that. And yet, tonight felt different. Tonight, something inside her twisted in a way that it hadn't before. She moved through the dining room with precision, her tray balanced carefully in her hands, her face an unreadable mask of professionalism. She had always been good at that, hiding whatever burned beneath the surface, swallowing down the words she would never be allowed to say. But as she approached Victoria's table again, she felt something shift. Victoria was speaking, her voice light and melodic, her fingers tracing idle patterns along the stem of her wineglass. Julia and Madison were laughing, their eyes gleaming with the easy amusement of those who had never been told no. They were halfway through their meal now, their plates arranged with the careful artistry expected of a restaurant like La Lumiere. Leah placed the fresh cloth on the table without a word. Victoria barely glanced at her. "That took long enough," she said, her tone casual, almost lazy. "I was beginning to think you'd forgotten about us." Leah did not react. She had learned long ago that silence was often the safest response. Victoria let out a soft hum, turning back to her plate. She lifted her fork, spearing a perfectly seared piece of filet mignon, then brought it to her lips with slow deliberation. The moment the food touched her tongue, she stilled. Then she set the fork down with a sharp clink against the porcelain. "This is overcooked," she said, the words smooth, but with an edge sharp enough to cut. Madison raised a delicate brow. "Really?" Julia leaned forward slightly, studying Victoria's plate with mild curiosity. Victoria exhaled as if deeply inconvenienced. "I asked for medium rare. This is practically well done." She lifted her gaze to Leah for the first time since she had arrived at the table, her expression one of measured disappointment. "I assume this was your mistake?" A hush fell over the table, not loud enough for the rest of the restaurant to hear, but enough that it felt intentional, enough that it felt like a performance. Leah's grip on the tray tightened slightly. "I'm sorry, ma'am," she said, keeping her voice steady. "I can have the kitchen remake it for you." Victoria sighed. "Don't bother apologizing. Just try to do your job properly next time." Julia let out a quiet laugh, shaking her head as if to say, "Can you believe this?" Madison smirked. "You'd think it wouldn't be so hard to get a steak right." The comment was meant to sting. It did. Leah felt the heat rise at the back of her neck, but she forced herself to remain still, to let the words pass over her without leaving a mark. She had done this before. She had endured worse. She reached for the plate, carefully lifting it from the table. Victoria watched her, eyes gleaming with something unreadable. Then, just as Leah turned to walk away, Victoria's voice rang out again, louder this time, deliberate. "I swear, they'll hire anyone these days." The words carried, drifting through the air just enough to draw the attention of those seated nearby. A few heads turned. Some guests looked away quickly, unwilling to involve themselves. Others exchanged quiet glances, their expressions shifting with the subtle discomfort of witnessing something unpleasant, but knowing better than to intervene. Leah felt the weight of their gazes, the way they pressed against her skin like a phantom touch. Victoria's lips curved. She was enjoying this. Leah didn't react. She simply turned, walking toward the kitchen, her posture unbroken. Behind her, Victoria laughed. Madison and Julia joined in. And across the restaurant, at the farthest table in the corner, Henry Beckett placed his glass down carefully, the stemware settling against the table with a soft, deliberate sound. He had seen enough. He did not speak. Not yet. But his gaze followed Leah as she disappeared into the kitchen, his expression unreadable. And when he looked back at Victoria, his fingers tapped against the edge of the table in quiet thought. The kitchen was a sharp contrast to the quiet refinement of the dining room. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of seared meat, garlic, and fresh herbs. The rhythmic clatter of knives against cutting boards, the sizzle of butter melting in hot pans, and the steady commands of the head chef created a world of controlled chaos. Leah stepped through the swinging doors, her fingers tightening around the plate she carried. The moment she entered, the noise swallowed her whole, a welcome distraction from the echo of laughter that still clung to the edges of her thoughts. She exhaled slowly, steadying herself, reminding herself that this was nothing new. But something about tonight felt different. She approached the pass, setting the rejected steak down before the chef. Sebastian, the sommelier, glanced up from where he stood beside the bar, catching the look on her face before his gaze flickered to the plate. He didn't ask what had happened. He didn't need to. He had seen the way Victoria Cross treated people like Leah before. "Medium rare," she said simply, keeping her voice even. The chef, a stout man with a face weathered by years of experience, let out a slow breath through his nose, shaking his head as he reached for a fresh cut of filet. "Of course," she complained. Leah said nothing as she watched him sear the meat, moving with efficiency and precision. The heat from the grill radiated outward, a stark contrast to the lingering chill in her skin. "She does this every time," one of the line cooks muttered under his breath as he reached for a pan. "Thinks if she sends something back, it proves she's important." "She wants a reaction," Sebastian added, leaning against the counter. "And you're not giving her one. That's what's making it worse." Leah knew he was right. Victoria's game was only fun when her target acknowledged it, when they gave her the satisfaction of frustration or anger. But Leah had spent her entire life swallowing down those reactions, learning to smooth them over into something polished and unreadable. Still, it didn't make it any easier. The chef plated the new steak with practiced ease, garnishing it before sliding it onto the pass. "Here, perfectly medium rare. If she complains again, tell her to eat somewhere else." Leah didn't smile, but something inside her steadied at the chef's quiet defiance. She lifted the plate and turned back toward the dining room. As she stepped through the doors, the hum of conversation washed over her again, pulling her back into the carefully curated elegance of La Lumiere. The chandeliers cast a golden glow over the room, illuminating the faces of the wealthy patrons who dined without a care in the world. And at the corner table, Henry Beckett watched. He had been observant all evening, his expression calm, unreadable. There was no outward indication of disapproval, no furrow of the brow or tightening of the jaw. But his eyes told a different story. They followed Leah's movements with quiet precision, taking in the stiffness of her posture, the way her shoulders squared just slightly more than necessary, the way her fingers gripped the edge of the plate as if grounding herself. And then there was Victoria. She had not moved from her seat, still draped in effortless arrogance, still the center of attention at her table. She was laughing at something Julia had said, her posture relaxed, her satisfaction clear. Leah approached with measured steps, placing the fresh plate in front of Victoria with the same quiet efficiency she had carried all evening. "The chef has prepared a new fillet for you, ma'am," she said evenly. "Medium rare, as requested." Victoria barely spared her a glance as she picked up her knife, slicing into the steak with deliberate slowness. Leah watched as the blade cut cleanly through the tender meat, revealing the warm pink center. It was perfect, exactly as it should be. For a moment, Victoria said nothing. Then she let out a small, considering hum. "I suppose this will do." She set down her knife, lifting her wineglass instead. "Next time, though," she added, almost as an afterthought, "try to get it right the first time." Leah's grip on her tray remained steady. She nodded once, professionally, before stepping away. And then Victoria smirked. "You should have seen how she walked just now," she murmured to Julia and Madison, loud enough for Leah to hear as she moved away. "Like she could barely stand up straight. If she can't even carry a plate properly, maybe she should be flipping burgers somewhere instead." Laughter. Light, delicate, cruel. Leah kept walking, her steps measured, controlled. But inside, something cracked. She had endured insults before, had learned to let them roll off her like water over stone. But there was something about the casual ease with which Victoria dismissed her, the way she spoke as if Leah wasn't even human, just an inconvenience, an irritation meant to be dealt with and discarded, that made her pulse tighten in her throat. And she wasn't the only one who noticed. At his corner table, Henry Beckett's fingers tapped idly against the tablecloth. His eyes remained on Victoria, his expression still unreadable. Then, with the quiet decisiveness of a man accustomed to power, he lifted his hand and gestured for the restaurant's manager. The movement was subtle, unnoticed by most, but it would change everything. The air in La Lumiere had shifted. It was subtle, an almost imperceptible change in atmosphere, like the tightening of strings on a violin before the first note of an overture. Conversation still flowed, the low hum of voices blending with the soft melody of the grand piano in the corner, but there was something else now, something quieter, heavier, a weight beneath the polished refinement of the evening. Leah felt it. She had carried plates and trays through this restaurant hundreds of times before, had heard her name spoken in clipped commands and dismissive murmurs, had endured the pointed glances and unspoken hierarchies that ruled places like this. But tonight, something was different. The weight of Victoria Cross's words still clung to her like a second skin. She knew better than to let it get to her. She had spent years training herself to be indifferent, to push through with her head held high and her eyes fixed ahead. But Victoria had a way of speaking that left wounds even where they couldn't be seen. The way she laughed, the way she turned every moment into a performance for her audience. She was not just cruel, she enjoyed it. She drew pleasure from seeing the discomfort in others, from knowing they were powerless to do anything but endure. And Leah had endured. But she wasn't sure how much more she could take. She moved through the restaurant, collecting empty plates and refilling wine glasses, forcing her hands to remain steady even as her mind raced. She could still hear Victoria's voice behind her, the light, musical lilt of her laughter as she leaned toward Julia and Madison, whispering something that sent them into another fit of quiet amusement. It was always like this. And yet, this time, something inside Leah felt different. The restaurant manager approached her as she returned to the server's station. He was a tall man, impeccably dressed with the kind of careful politeness that never quite hid the calculation beneath his expression. He was always aware of everything happening in his restaurant, every misplaced glass, every unsatisfied customer, every moment of tension that could ripple through the carefully controlled elegance of La Lumiere. But tonight, he wasn't watching the guests. He was watching Henry Beckett. Leah followed his gaze just in time to see the older man lean back in his chair, his expression calm, his fingers resting lightly against the tablecloth. He didn't speak, didn't even look toward the manager directly, just lifted a single hand in a subtle, measured gesture. The manager hesitated for half a second before stepping forward. Leah turned back to her work, forcing herself not to watch. Whatever was happening, it wasn't her concern. She had enough to focus on without trying to unravel the silent conversation passing between the owner and the man in the gray suit. But then Victoria spoke again. And this time, she made sure everyone heard her. "I can't believe they let people like her work here," she said, her voice light, almost playful as if sharing a joke. "Honestly, it's embarrassing. This place used to have standards." The words were a knife, and they cut deep. Silence stretched around the table. The laughter that had followed her earlier remarks did not come this time, but neither Julia nor Madison corrected her. They merely exchanged looks, small smiles playing at their lips, the amusement still lingering beneath their perfectly composed faces. Leah stood frozen for a fraction of a second, the tray in her hands suddenly heavier than it had been moments before. Then, with practiced ease, she turned, forcing herself to keep moving. She could not react. She could not afford to. She walked toward the kitchen, her posture unbroken, but her breath came just a little too shallow, her fingers just a little too tight around the edges of the tray. She had almost reached the door when she heard the chair scrape against the floor. She didn't turn at first. She didn't need to. She already knew who it was. Henry Beckett rose from his seat with quiet deliberation, his movements slow, precise, unhurried. The restaurant did not fall silent. Conversations continued, wine glasses tilted in careless toasts, but there was a shift, a pause. The kind of quiet attention that only comes when something significant is about to happen. Leah kept walking, pushing through the kitchen doors, but as she stepped inside, she realized something. She wasn't shaken anymore. She exhaled slowly, setting the tray down on the counter. And for the first time all evening, she let herself hope that maybe, just maybe, tonight would be different. The hush that had settled over La Lumiere was almost imperceptible, the kind of silence that did not fully extinguish the usual sounds of the evening, but dulled them, made them distant. The clinking of silverware against fine porcelain, the murmur of conversation, the careful footsteps of waiters gliding between tables, all of it remained, yet there was something beneath it now, something unseen, something felt. At the center of it stood Henry Beckett. He did not move with haste, nor did he demand attention as he straightened from his chair. Instead, his presence commanded it naturally, effortlessly, in a way that came not from raised voices or grand gestures, but from the quiet certainty of a man who spoke only when necessary. The kind of man who had no need to prove his authority because it had long been ingrained in the very spaces he occupied. Victoria had not yet noticed him. She was still laughing, still basking in the moment, unaware that the room had begun to shift around her. But others had noticed. The restaurant manager approached Henry swiftly, his polished shoes barely making a sound against the marble floors. He was careful, deliberate in the way he leaned slightly toward him, voice low enough that only those nearest could hear. "Sir?" Henry's gaze did not shift from Victoria's table. His voice, when he spoke, was quiet but firm. "Bring the young woman here." The manager hesitated for the briefest of moments. He was a man well versed in reading the unspoken rules of power, in recognizing the delicate balance between catering to the restaurant's wealthiest patrons and maintaining the reputation of the establishment itself. And yet, something about Henry Beckett's tone left no room for negotiation. He nodded once before turning toward the kitchen. Leah had been stacking plates in the back when she saw the manager step through the swinging doors. She knew before he even spoke that he had come for her. For a second, she considered refusing. Every instinct told her to stay where she was, to let this night play out the way every other night had before it. To endure. To let the words, the laughter, the humiliation fade into another nameless evening among hundreds. But something stopped her. Maybe it was the way the air felt different, charged with something unspoken. Maybe it was the way the staff had gone quiet as the manager crossed the kitchen, their eyes flickering between him and her, waiting. Or maybe it was the exhaustion that had settled into her bones, the weight of too many nights like this pressing down on her shoulders. She set down the plate she was holding. The restaurant manager did not look at her with pity. He did not offer any indication of what was about to happen. He simply nodded toward the dining room. "Come with me." Leah wiped her hands on the edge of her apron, straightened her posture, and followed. When she stepped back onto the floor of La Lumiere, she felt the shift immediately. It was in the way the waiters had stilled at the edges of the room, in the way certain guests had turned their heads slightly, their attention carefully disguised beneath feigned interest in their meals. It was in the way Victoria's voice, sharp, cutting, unaware, still carried, but now met with the quiet expectation of something about to break. And then Victoria noticed. She looked up, irritation flickering across her face as she registered Henry Beckett standing beside her table. "Can I help you?" she asked, the faintest edge of impatience in her voice, as if she had been interrupted mid-performance. Henry did not answer immediately. Instead, he turned his head slightly, just enough to acknowledge Leah as she came to stand beside the manager. His gaze was steady, unreadable. Only then did he speak. "You have been rude to my staff." It was not a question. It was not even an accusation. It was a simple, undeniable statement. Victoria blinked. For the first time that evening, the practiced ease of her expression faltered. "I beg your pardon?" The room had gone impossibly still. Henry did not raise his voice, yet somehow it carried. "You have treated this young woman with disrespect," he continued, each word precise, deliberate. "You have mocked her, humiliated her, belittled her work, and you have done so with the belief that there would be no consequence." Victoria let out a small, breathy laugh, a sound of disbelief rather than amusement. I think you might be misunderstanding." "I'm not misunderstanding anything." The interruption was quiet, yet absolute. Victoria sat back in her chair, fingers curling around the stem of her wineglass. For the first time, she seemed to notice the way the restaurant had shifted around her, the way people were listening, the way eyes, some discreet, some not, had turned toward her table. "This is a private conversation," she said, her tone sharpening, "and I don't believe this concerns you." Henry tilted his head slightly. "This is my restaurant," he said, "and I believe it does." Silence. Then Julia let out a nervous little laugh. "Mr. Beckett," she said lightly, her voice adopting a tone of careful diplomacy, "I'm sure there's been some misunderstanding. We were only having a bit of fun." Madison nodded in agreement, reaching for her water glass as if the entire conversation were a minor inconvenience rather than something worth acknowledging. Henry did not look at them. His attention remained on Victoria. "I will not tolerate people who treat others as less than them," he said. "Not in my restaurant, not anywhere." Victoria's jaw tightened, but she forced a smile, though it did not quite reach her eyes. "I see," she said, her voice cool. "And what do you intend to do about it?" Henry did not hesitate. "The cost of your meal will be donated to a foundation that supports young people working to pay for their education," he said, "and you will not be welcome here again." This time, Victoria's composure slipped entirely. She stared at him as if she had misheard. "You're banning me?" Henry held her gaze. "I am." A flush crept up Victoria's throat, the color rising against her carefully applied makeup. She glanced toward her friends, as if expecting them to interject, to support her. But Julia and Madison remained silent, their previous amusement now replaced with uncertainty. Somewhere in the restaurant, a chair shifted, the sound of someone clearing their throat, the soft clink of a glass being set down. Victoria exhaled sharply, then let out a short, humorless laugh. "Well," she said, reaching for her purse, her movements quick, clipped, "I suppose we'll be taking our business elsewhere then." She rose from her seat, chin lifted, expression hard with wounded pride. Neither Julia nor Madison spoke as they followed her. The restaurant remained quiet as they crossed the dining room as the doors swung shut behind them, as their presence faded into the night. Only then did the air shift again. Leah did not move. She was still standing beside the manager, still watching the empty space where Victoria had been only moments before. Then, slowly, she turned her head toward Henry Beckett. For the first time, he looked at her directly, and he nodded. A small gesture, but somehow it meant everything. The doors of La Lumiere swung shut behind Victoria Cross and her entourage, and for a long moment the restaurant remained suspended in an unnatural stillness. It was not silence, not truly, but rather a pause, a collective intake of breath, as if the space itself were recalibrating after the sudden departure of its most disruptive element. Then, slowly, the rhythm of the evening resumed. A waiter refilled a glass of wine at a nearby table. A hushed conversation picked up again. The pianist in the corner, who had hesitated ever so slightly, continued playing his melody, his fingers gliding over the keys as though nothing at all had happened. But something had changed. Leah remained standing beside the manager, her posture as straight as it had been when she first stepped out of the kitchen. Yet there was a difference in her now, an awareness that she could not quite name, as though the air around her had shifted in a way she had not expected. She had seen guests come and go before. She had witnessed complaints, outbursts, quiet conflicts hidden beneath polite words. But never had she seen someone like Victoria Cross, someone untouchable, someone who moved through the world with the unwavering certainty of their own importance, be held accountable. And certainly never for the sake of someone like her. The weight of Henry Beckett's words still echoed in her mind. "You will not be welcome here again." Victoria's face frozen in disbelief. The way Julia and Madison had looked away, suddenly small, suddenly uncertain. The way the restaurant had not erupted into whispers and scandal, but had simply watched. A silent agreement. A quiet acknowledgement that, for once, justice had been served in a place where it rarely was. Leah exhaled. She had spent the entire evening forcing herself to be invisible, to endure, to move forward as she always did. And yet, in the end, she had been seen. Henry Beckett had seen her. Now, as if sensing her thoughts, the man himself turned his gaze toward her. He did not offer her a smile, nor any outward display of triumph or satisfaction. Instead, he studied her with the same quiet consideration he had maintained all evening, his expression unreadable but not unkind. He gave a single nod, a gesture so small and yet so deliberate that it felt heavier than words. Then, without another glance, he returned to his seat. The restaurant manager, who had been standing stiffly beside Leah, exhaled almost imperceptibly before turning to her. "Get back to work," he said, though there was no sharpness in his tone. Leah nodded. She moved without hesitation, returning to the tasks that had occupied her all evening, clearing empty plates, refilling glasses, checking on guests who, for the first time, met her eyes when they spoke to her. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but she felt it. Something had shifted, not just in the restaurant, but in her. She was still exhausted. Her feet still ached from hours of walking back and forth across the floor. The night was not over, and there were still tables to be served, still dishes to be collected. Tomorrow there would be more shifts, more long hours, more customers who would see her only as a function of their evening, rather than a person in her own right. But tonight had been different. Tonight, something had cracked in the foundation of how things were supposed to be. And as Leah moved through the dining room carrying trays and collecting empty glasses, she found herself walking just a little taller. By the time the night reached its natural conclusion, La Lumiere had returned to the poised elegance that defined it. The scent of fine wine lingered in the air, mingling with the last traces of caramelized butter and fresh herbs. The guests, though still engaged in quiet conversation, carried a different air about them, an awareness, subtle but undeniable, that something significant had transpired. Leah moved through the dining room collecting empty plates and glasses, her movements as precise as they had been at the start of the evening. Yet, something about the way she carried herself had changed. She wasn't sure if it was visible to others, but she felt it deep in her bones, an unspoken shift in the way she occupied space. For the first time in a long while, she did not feel like a shadow moving between tables. The moment Victoria Cross had walked out, something unspoken had settled over the room. The usual hierarchy of power, so deeply ingrained in places like this, had been disrupted, if only for a night. The unspoken rules had been broken, the balance momentarily shifted in a way that most guests would forget by morning. But Leah wouldn't forget. She had seen too much, endured too much, to believe that one evening could change the world. There would be more nights like this, more Victorias, more laughter at her expense, more moments where she would have to remind herself to swallow her pride and move forward. And yet, tonight had been different. Not because of what had been said, but because for once, someone had said something at all. As she approached a table near the window, a woman, a middle-aged guest with silver streaks in her hair and an elegant emerald scarf draped around her shoulders, paused as Leah reached for her plate. "You handled yourself well tonight," the woman murmured, her voice low enough that only Leah could hear. Leah hesitated for the briefest of moments. She'd never expected acknowledgement, let alone praise. It was easier to exist in silence, to accept that the nature of her work meant being overlooked. But now she met the woman's gaze and nodded. "Thank you." The woman said nothing more, simply setting down her glass and turning back to her conversation. But the words stayed with Leah as she moved to the next table. She wasn't the only one who had noticed the shift. At another table, a man who had earlier been absorbed in his meal now made a point to thank her when she refilled his water. A woman in a navy blue dress left a tip far larger than necessary, folding the crisp bill beneath her plate with a quiet acknowledgement. Small things, subtle things, but they meant something. By the time the last guests filtered out into the night, the restaurant had quieted, the candlelight flickering over empty tables. The staff moved quickly now, clearing away the remnants of the evening, stacking chairs, wiping down surfaces. The hum of conversation had faded, replaced by the more familiar sounds of a restaurant preparing to close, distant clatters from the kitchen, the rhythmic sweep of a broom across marble floors. Leah gathered the last of the silverware, stacking it carefully before carrying it to the back. She was tired, her feet ached, her shoulders heavy with the weight of the long shift, but it was a different kind of exhaustion than usual. Not just weariness, but something else, something lighter. As she stepped into the kitchen, she caught sight of Henry Beckett standing near the bar, speaking quietly with the restaurant manager. He had remained at his table long after Victoria had gone, sipping his wine, observing the way the evening played out in the absence of disruption. Now, as Leah passed by, he turned his head ever so slightly. They did not exchange words. He simply nodded to her once, an acknowledgement, nothing more. And that was enough. She continued past him, disappearing into the kitchen, her hands already moving to finish the night's final tasks. Tomorrow she would return. The world would not have changed overnight. The restaurant would still serve its usual clientele, and she would still weave between tables, unseen by most. There would still be long hours, difficult guests, moments where she would have to bite her tongue and remind herself why she was here. But tonight had given her something she had not expected, a reminder that she was not invisible. That respect was not a privilege granted only to the wealthy, but something that could and should be expected. That sometimes, even in the most unlikely of places, the balance could shift, even if only for a moment. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe for more. Check out our other videos, you won't want to miss them. And if this story resonated with you, share it with someone who needs to hear it.